Unlock the secrets. This is the African Arcana.
Subscribe to reveal more mysteries within the African Arcana.
I used to believe in the numbers. GDP growth, investment charts, FDI reports with clean fonts and confident language. You know the type. Emerging market potential. Agricultural reform zones. Strategic land access. Sounds impressive. Sounds like something's getting better. Until you ask, for who? Because in Burkina Faso, for years, development looked like barbed wire around a mango grove, like eviction letters delivered without a name, like grandmothers squatting next to solar farms they were never allowed to enter. They called it modernization, but it felt like quiet erasure. People didn't scream. They adjusted, moved further down the hill, started over, again and again and again. Until one day there was nothing left to move on to. So when Captain Traoré signed that land reform decree in 2025, I'll be honest, I rolled my eyes. I thought it was another nationalist performance, another hero in fatigues trying to control headlines. I'd seen it before. Haven't we all? But then, the silence came. Not the usual silence of being ignored, the kind that comes right before something big hits the ground and shakes everything loose. So yeah, at first I thought it was a stunt. But then I saw a man in Zorgo fall to his knees clutching a lease with his name on it. Not his village's. His. And something in me said, maybe this time it's not a performance. Maybe it's a correction. See, land grabs don't always come with guns. Sometimes they come with logos. Polished PowerPoints. A handshake between a minister and a man flown in business class. Most people never even knew it was happening. It wasn't on the evening news. It wasn't shouted from podiums. It was quiet, legal, efficient. A palm oil company from Singapore leased 20,000 hectares in the south. A French agribusiness secured grazing rights larger than Ouagadougou. Gulf investors signed 99-year deals that outlived the people signing them. And the clause that showed up again and again? Unused land subject to development allocation. Unused? Tell that to the women who'd been planting groundnuts there for 40 years. Tell that to the kids who ran through those bush paths after school. But legally, it didn't matter. No title, no proof. Then it was empty. Available. A bargain. They called it efficiency. But it looked a lot like theft with better PR. And when communities pushed back, when they marched or wrote letters or even just asked for a meeting, they were told the same line. The project is for your benefit. Be patient. Except the benefit never came. The roads stayed broken. The schools stayed underfunded. But the fences? Oh, those came fast. That's the part that never gets mentioned in the economic reports. The sound of silence when your land disappears and everyone acts like you should be grateful. So when Traoré tore up those old agreements, banned foreign ownership, and rewrote the rules, it wasn't radical. It was overdue. But let me ask you, what kind of world do we live in, where giving land back to its own people is considered a threat? It didn't happen with fanfare. No marching bands, no staged applause, no crowds waving flags like a football match. Just one man, one pen, one sentence. From this day forward, no land in Burkina Faso shall be owned by a foreign entity. That was it. But somehow it felt louder than any speech he could have given. Because here's the truth. This country had seen enough speeches. Enough reforms that weren't. Enough strategic partnerships where the only strategy was who got rich first. So when Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed that paper, something strange happened. Not fireworks, not chaos, just stillness. People froze, not in fear, but in disbelief. A farmer in Yako turned up the radio. A market woman in Banfora stopped mid-transaction. In some towns, they say everything went quiet for a full minute. like the air was holding its breath. Because buried in that sentence was something we hadn't felt in years. Consequence. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was law. And the kind of law that doesn't come with footnotes. No pending implementation. No pilot program. Just, you cannot buy our land anymore. Period. It took less than 48 hours for the first cracks to show. Foreign firms that had been grabbing hectares like candy suddenly went dark. Real estate offices closed shop midweek. Brokers, once untouchable, started avoiding their own clients. One man I know, a mid-tier fixer, burned 3 land contracts in his courtyard, said he didn't want to get caught holding ghost paper. But you want to know what really hit? It wasn't the panic. It was the shift in posture. Suddenly, people who'd been silent for years started asking questions. Wait, does this mean my grandfather's land can't be sold anymore? If they revoke foreign leases, what happens to ours? Will we finally get the documents they promised back in '97? And that's when it became clear. This wasn't just a legal reform. It was a psychological reset. Because for decades, people were told land was a commodity, a product, a square on a spreadsheet that changed hands based on who had the most lawyers. And now, the rules had flipped. You couldn't just buy a country piece by piece anymore. You had to ask. You had to explain. You had to serve something bigger than your own bottom line. And that terrified people who weren't used to answering to anyone. So yeah, no tanks rolled out, no embassies burned, no shots fired, just a signature. And somehow, it landed like a warning shot heard around the world. You could almost feel it, like the land itself exhaled. Not in a grand, mythical way, in a real, dusty, sun-scorched kind of way. The kind of breath you take after holding it too long. Decades too long. Because once that law was signed, something changed. Not just on paper, but underfoot. Villages that had been in legal limbo for generations finally had names on maps. People who'd been squatting on their own ancestral fields were now being called owners, or at least leaseholders, with the kind of paperwork that couldn't be waved away by a bureaucrat or sold off by someone in a shiny suit. And it wasn't abstract. Mobile land trucks started rolling out, literal caravans carrying scanners, printers, and solar panels. Civil servants, the kind who used to sit behind desks and avoid eye contact, were suddenly riding out to remote provinces, shaking hands with farmers, helping grandmothers place inked thumbs on certificates. In the Sahel region, entire hamlets that had never received a census were now being geotagged, not for surveillance, but for protection, for recognition. People started sleeping differently, not because they got richer, but because the question, what if they take it, stopped hanging over them like a curse, and the shift didn't stop there. Community councils were formed, some ad hoc, some old school, built from existing village hierarchies. But this time, they weren't ceremonial. They had teeth. They resolved land disputes that had dragged on for 20 years, in 3 meetings. In one village near Kopela, 2 families fighting over a field since 1991 finally agreed to split it. The compromise? One would keep the trees, the other the river access. Neither side won, but for the first time, both felt like they weren't being cheated. This wasn't some utopia. It was messy, imperfect, full of tension. But it was theirs. And when you've lived your whole life on borrowed soil, there's a kind of power in knowing that no one, not a company, not a colonel, not a cousin in the capital, can sell it out from under you anymore. One man said it best, while planting onions with his son. Before I was growing food on hope. Now I'm growing it on proof. It didn't take long. The same world that barely noticed Burkina Faso for years suddenly couldn't stop staring. Not because of a war, not because of a disaster, but because the country said one word, no, and meant it. You could see it ripple in real time. A European telecom conglomerate halted a 300-mile infrastructure rollout overnight, citing regulatory uncertainty. An American think tank released a white paper titled, "The Risks of Populist Land Reform in the Sahel." The IMF went quiet, but not before issuing a subtle warning. All structural adjustments remain contingent on investor confidence. Investor confidence. That phrase again. What they really meant was, this place is getting too confident for our liking. Because if Burkina Faso could cut off foreign land ownership and survive, what's to stop others? That was the fear. Not failure. Success. And the pushback came fast. And quiet. Like all the best pressure does. Development loans delayed. NGO projects quietly paused. Agricultural funding reviewed. Friendly meetings that turned icy without explanation. A whisper campaign dressed up in diplomacy. And in some elite circles within the region, oh, they panicked. Officials who once bragged about streamlining land access for foreign investors now found themselves under public scrutiny. One high-profile land ministry director resigned in the middle of a press briefing. Another fled to Senegal. Nobody cried for them. But outside the boardrooms, different story. On the ground, people started asking sharper questions. Why is it that when we gave away land, no one called it a risk? But when we take it back, it's suddenly a crisis? Why is feeding ourselves controversial, but exporting everything isn't? In Bobo Dioulasso, I heard an old man mutter something under his breath at a market. If it makes them nervous, maybe we finally did something right. Meanwhile, newspapers abroad ran with the same tired headlines. Burkina Faso turns inward. Economic nationalism threatens stability. A dangerous precedent for Africa. But here's what they never printed. That foreign land grabs displaced more people than any drought in the last decade. That so-called efficient agriculture often meant spraying pesticides on millet fields next to schools. That development never quite reached the villages where the land came from. So when the global system started clutching its pearls, people here didn't blink. They were too busy fencing their fields, signing papers, replanting what had been lost, because sometimes what looks like chaos from the outside is just sovereignty from the inside. Here's what they were betting on: that we couldn't organize, that once the headlines faded, once the declarations got old, we'd fumble the follow-through. Bureaucracy would choke it. Corruption would rot it. People would give up like they always had to. But this time, we were ready. Within 2 weeks of the reform, mobile land caravans were already on the road, solar panels strapped to the roofs, satellite uplinks in the back, and a ragtag team of civil servants, tech kids, and village elders bouncing through dusty trails. No red carpets. No PR. Just the job. They called it the Zaka Protocol. Zaka, named after the Mossi word for foundation, because that's what it was. Each province had a council, not the rubber stamp kind. Real people, farmers, co-op leaders, teachers, reviewing land claims in public. Every dispute logged, every lease tied to a biometric ID. No bribes, no brokers, and no favor-for-favor deals. Even the paperwork looked different, printed in 3 languages, laminated on recycled plastic so it wouldn't disintegrate after one rainy season. On the back, a QR code that linked to a blockchain-secured national registry. Sounds like overkill? Maybe. But when you've been burned for decades by lost records and missing files, overkill feels like justice. In the Center-Nord region, a woman named Salamata finally received a lease to her late husband's field. She'd been fighting for it since 2006. 15 years of closed doors. 1 land truck, 1 scan. 15 minutes later, it was hers. And she's not a statistic. She's the reason the system worked. They trained 3,200 new clerks in 3 months, most of them under 30. Gave them tablets, bikes, and a mandate. Go village by village, verify everything, ask questions, don't assume. Even the old land agents, the ones people used to fear, were suddenly behaving differently. You walk into an office now, and they greet you, look you in the eye, because they know this time the people are watching, and the paper talks. Meanwhile, something unexpected started to bloom. Trust. Not blind trust. Not the naive kind. The cautious, earned kind. A young man in Tenkodogo said it better than I ever could. For the first time, I didn't need to know someone to get something done. That line hit hard. Because isn't that the dream? Not charity. Not pity. Just a process that doesn't punish you for being ordinary. So, yeah, the system's not perfect. But it's ours. And it works. Which is exactly what they were afraid of. Let's be real. Most revolutions don't happen with fireworks. They happen slowly, quietly, beneath the surface where power pretends it can't hear. But in Burkina Faso, once the land started moving, so did everything else. Because land was never just about crops, it was about leverage. And now that people had it, legally, visibly, undeniably, they started using it. Village councils that used to be symbolic? They became decision makers, not just on land issues, but on schools, roads, market hours, even how aid money should be used. Suddenly, the mayor couldn't just approve a road project without showing up to explain himself. Suddenly, the governor's cousin couldn't sneak in a zoning change and flip a plot for profit. People were paying attention. People were showing up. People were calling bullshit. And the dominoes started falling. In Bobo Dioulasso, a group of shea butter producers, mostly women, used their lease documents to form a legal collective, registered it, opened a bank account, bought machinery with a microloan. Their production tripled in 6 months. They didn't ask for permission. They used what they already had. In Kudugu, a group of youth leaders set up land literacy classes in football fields. No blackboards, just printed maps, real cases, and a loudspeaker. Kids as young as 14 were learning how to check coordinates, verify QR codes, spot forged leases. And in the capital, the political winds began to shift. The old parties, bloated with donor money and old slogans, started losing local races to unknowns. Teachers, nurses, co-op members, people with no campaign posters, just a binder of lease cases they'd helped process. One man in Toma won a district seat by knocking on 800 doors with a single line. "I'm not here to promise electricity. I'm here to protect your field." He won by a landslide. Even in national politics, things got weird. A parliamentary committee on land reform, once just a rubber stamp, suddenly became the most watched hearing in the country. Live streams, comment sections, clipped videos going viral with hashtags like #PaperIsPower and #LaTerre People weren't just watching government. They were expecting it to work. And that terrified the people who'd built their careers on being untouchable. Because for decades, the poor were told they didn't understand policy, that they didn't have the education to participate, that governance was for men in suits speaking in legalese. But now, a woman who never stepped inside a school could hold up a lease, point to a boundary and say, "This is mine. You don't need to understand it. I do." And suddenly, that was enough. So no, this wasn't a revolution with rifles. It was a redistribution of voice. And if land gave people a place to stand, their voices gave them something louder, a reason to stay standing. It started with whispers. Ghanaian delegates showing up unannounced. Malian reformers asking for documents. A quiet visit from a Senegalese policy advisor who kept saying, "This cannot be a one-country thing." Then came the questions. How did they verify claims without formal deeds? What tech stack runs the registry? Who arbitrates disputes when no court exists nearby? How the hell did they get it done without World Bank consultants? Burkina Faso had become contagious. But not in the way the West feared. This wasn't some violent ideology bleeding across borders. This was infrastructure, process, proof. And the infection vector? Hope. In rural Kenya, radio shows started covering the Zaka protocol. In southern Malawi, a village co-op built a DIY registry based on QR-tagged parcels after hearing about it on a WhatsApp forward. In northern Nigeria, farmers began protesting against state deals signed without consultation, citing the Burkina precedent. This wasn't branding. It was blueprint. And that made certain people very nervous. The IMF began revising language in its Sahel agricultural reports, swapping ownership efficiency with land tenure dynamics. An EU task force was quietly formed to monitor the implications of non-tradable land regimes. At a development summit in Brussels, someone had the audacity to call Burkina's model a regional destabilizer. But guess who didn't flinch? Countries that had been watching the same movie for too long. Foreign investors buy. Governments nod. People get displaced. Protests break out. The media moves on. Repeat. Except now, the script had a plot twist. Because what if owning land wasn't the goal? What if belonging to land and protecting it was more powerful than title deeds in English with embossed seals? That question hit hardest among the diaspora. In Paris, a Burkinabe doctor started a fund to digitize land records in his hometown. In New York, a group of second-gen kids launched a podcast called Soil and Sovereignty. And in Abidjan, a street mural went up, spray-painted on a cracked wall next to a market. The land is not your product. It is your proof of being here. This wasn't just a national policy anymore. It was becoming a Pan-African provocation. Not of rage, but of reimagination. And the message was clear. If the poorest nation in the region can reclaim its future from the soil up, what's stopping the rest of us? This wasn't about land anymore. It hadn't been for a while. What started as paperwork turned into posture. People were walking different, talking different, standing different. I saw it first in a market in Kaya. A woman selling cassava, same stall as always. But this time her lease certificate was pinned behind her on the wall, framed like a family photo. I asked her why. She smiled. So people know I'm not temporary. That hit hard. Because that's what it had always been, hadn't it? Not just poverty, not just inequality, but temporariness. A life where everything felt borrowed, your land, your rights, even your presence. Now suddenly, people had proof they belonged, and it changed them. Teenagers who used to dream of leaving started asking what it'd take to start solar irrigation on the family plot. Grandmothers started talking about succession planning like CEOs. One young man in Fada told me, "My dad always told me, don't get involved, they'll only take it." But now he's the one drawing crop maps at the kitchen table. And it wasn't just individuals. Whole communities started rethinking themselves. In Dedugu, a group of tailors pooled their leases to build a shared production facility. No donors, no bank loans. Just trust, sweat, and the kind of slow, stubborn confidence you can only get from holding your own piece of the earth. In Tenkodogo, an imam and a priest co-hosted a land rights seminar. That had never happened, not even during peace campaigns. But somehow, the ground had become common ground. And you could feel it, in weddings, in funerals, in Friday prayers and Sunday masses. Not some patriotic hysteria, something quieter, something deeper. A return to the belief that the future was not some distant place you had to beg your way into. It was here, under your feet. Finally. One evening, I stood next to a man watching his daughter dig holes for okra seedlings. He didn't say much, just stood there, arms folded. After a while, he said, "They told us for years that this land was worthless, but my daughter just planted tomorrow in it." It's easy to call it a land reform. That's the headline. That's the language on the white papers. That's the sanitized version that fits neatly on someone else's policy brief. But on the ground, It felt more like a reclamation of breath, of space, of self. This was never just about hectares. It was about memory, about dignity, about not being erased in your own home. Because when you've spent decades farming land that legally belonged to someone you've never met, someone with soft hands and hard lawyers, you stop believing in justice. You start believing in survival. And then one day the rules shift. Not for everyone, not overnight, but just enough to make people stop and hope again. Now women are printing out lease certificates and pinning them next to family photos. Young people are planting mango trees like they actually plan to stick around. Elders are updating boundary stones, not for nostalgia, but for legacy. This isn't utopia. There's still pushback, still politics, still risk. But something's been unlocked, and you can't unlock it. So here's my ask. Before you scroll on, pause. Think about your own neighborhood, your own family's land, or maybe the fact that your family never had any. Ask yourself, who gets to belong? Who gets to decide? And what would it mean anywhere in the world if people actually owned the future they live on? If that hits you, say something. Comment, share, add your story, or your anger, or your questions. Because if a country this small can shake the map, maybe it's time the map started listening.